In the shadowed corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets echo through stone walls, a moment of raw human vulnerability would shatter the carefully constructed facade of Britain's future king. What the palace guard witnessed that November evening would remain etched in his memory forever. A broken man, stripped of all royal pretense, weeping before the portrait of the woman whose love he had lost to duty, whose memory haunted every corner of his carefully orchestrated life. This is not just another royal scandal or tabloid sensation. This is the untold story of love's aftermath, of a heart that never learned to heal, and of the moment when even a king in waiting could no longer carry the weight of his choices. Behind the golden gates and pristine public appearances lay a truth so profound, so achingly human, that it would challenge everything the world thought it knew about the man who would one day wear the crown. The guard's discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would expose the delicate threads holding together one of the world's most scrutinized marriages. Revealing that beneath the royal titles and ceremonial duties, William was simply a man who had never stopped loving the mother who was taken from him too soon, and who now faced the devastating realization that his choices in love might have cost him more than he ever imagined. The November wind rattled the ancient windows of Windsor Castle as Guard Thompson made his rounds through the East Wing. 23 years of service had taught him to move silently through the corridors, his footsteps barely disturbing the thick Persian carpets that lined the hallways. The castle felt different tonight, heavy with an atmosphere he couldn't quite place. The usual evening routine had been disrupted earlier, when Camilla had left abruptly after what staff whispered was a heated argument with William. Thompson had seen many things during his years of service, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter in the portrait gallery that evening. As he approached the familiar corridor lined with paintings of former royals, he heard something that made him pause mid-step. The sound was low, almost inaudible but unmistakable. Someone was crying. His training kicked in immediately. Security protocols dictated that he investigate any unusual activity, but as he drew closer to the source of the sound, Thompson realized this was no ordinary security concern. The soft sobbing was coming from the direction of Diana's portrait, the one that had been quietly rehung in this lesser-visited section of the castle after years of storage. Moving carefully around the corner, Thompson's breath caught in his throat. There, collapsed in one of the antique chairs positioned before Diana's portrait, was Prince William. The future king sat hunched forward, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. The composed, dignified prince that the world knew was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Thompson witnessed something profoundly human. A son mourning his mother, a man confronting the weight of his choices. William's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the corridor, Thompson could hear every word. "I'm sorry, Mum. I'm so sorry. I don't know if I made the right choice. I don't know if you would understand." His words were punctuated by deep, shuddering breaths, the kind that come from crying that starts in the soul and works its way out. Thompson knew he should leave, should pretend he had never witnessed this moment of royal vulnerability. His duty was to protect the royal family, and sometimes that meant protecting them from having their private moments observed. But something about the scene held him frozen. Perhaps it was the recognition that he was witnessing history, not the sanitized version that would appear in official biographies, but the raw, unfiltered truth of a man struggling with impossible decisions. The portrait itself seemed to watch over the scene with maternal compassion. Diana's painted eyes, captured at her most radiant, gazed down with the same warmth that had made her beloved worldwide. The artist had managed to capture something indefinable in her expression, a combination of love, wisdom, and gentle understanding that seemed particularly poignant in this moment. William raised his head to look directly at the portrait, and Thompson could see the tears streaming down his face. "Everyone said I had to choose duty over love, but what if they were wrong? What if you would have wanted me to choose differently?" His voice cracked with emotion. "Camilla left tonight. She said I'll never love her the way I loved, the way I should love her. She's right, isn't she? How can I love anyone completely when part of my heart died with you?" The guard felt like an intruder in this moment of private anguish, yet he found himself unable to move. In his years of service, he had seen the royals in various states, formal, casual, frustrated, happy, but never had he witnessed such raw humanity. This wasn't Prince William, the future king. This was simply William, a man in his 40s still grieving his mother, still questioning the path his life had taken. The conversation William was having with the portrait continued, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in barely controlled sobs. He spoke about Catherine, about their early days at university, when love seemed simple and uncomplicated, He spoke about the pressure he felt to follow in his father's footsteps, to choose a bride who would fulfill royal expectations rather than following his heart completely. He spoke about the moment he realized that every woman he would ever love would be measured against the memory of his mother's warmth and unconditional love. "I see you in Kate sometimes," William continued, his voice steadier now but still thick with emotion, "in the way she loves the children, in her strength. But then I remember how the press treated you, how they hounded you, and I wonder if I've condemned her to the same fate. Am I protecting her, or am I just repeating the same patterns that destroyed you?" Thompson realized that what he was witnessing was more than just grief. It was a crisis of conscience. William wasn't just mourning his mother. He was questioning every major decision he had made since her death. The weight of the crown, the expectations of duty, the compromises required of royal life. All of it seemed to be crushing down on him in this moment. The November night deepened around them, and still William sat before his mother's portrait, sometimes speaking, sometimes just sitting in silence as tears continued to fall. Thompson knew that dawn would come, and with it, William would have to return to being the composed, dignified prince the world expected. But for now, in the sanctuary of this quiet corridor, he was allowed to be broken. As Thompson finally began to back away, giving the prince the privacy he deserved, he heard William's voice one more time, barely audible. "I miss you, Mum. I miss you every single day, and I don't know how to stop feeling like I'm failing you." The guard made his way back through the corridors, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. He had always known that the royals were human beneath their titles, but seeing such raw vulnerability had shaken something loose in his understanding of the family he had spent decades protecting. Tomorrow, Prince William would be back to his public duties, smiling and waving, fulfilling his royal obligations. But Thompson would carry the knowledge of this night with him, understanding that sometimes the greatest burdens are carried by those who seem to have everything. The morning after Thompson's discovery dawned grey and cold, matching the atmosphere that had settled over the royal household. Word travelled quickly through the staff quarters that Camilla had not returned to the castle, and her absence created a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the ancient building. In the kitchens, housekeepers, and security officers, conversations were conducted in hushed tones, everyone sensing that something significant had shifted in the delicate balance of royal relationships. William appeared at breakfast looking composed, but those who knew him well could see the telltale signs of a sleepless night. His eyes were slightly red-rimmed, carefully concealed by what appeared to be strategic lighting choices for his position at the table. Catherine sat across from him, her usual warm demeanour subdued as she navigated what was clearly a difficult morning. The children chatted about their school plans, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents swirling around the adult table. Thompson, who had barely slept after his encounter in the portrait gallery, found himself studying William with new eyes during his morning security briefing. The prince participated in discussions about the day's schedule with his usual attention to detail, but there was something different in his posture, a weight that seemed to pull at his shoulders despite his efforts to maintain royal bearing. The catalyst for what would become known among palace staff as the unravelling came in the form of a phone call from King Charles III around mid-morning. Thompson, positioned outside William's private study, could hear the raised voices through the heavy wooden door, something that was virtually unprecedented in his experience. Royal disagreements were typically conducted in controlled, measured tones, but this conversation was clearly different. "She what?" William's voice carried clearly, the shock evident even through the door. "When did this happen? Why wasn't I informed immediately?" There was a pause, presumably as Charles explained something, and then William's voice again, this time with an edge that Thompson had never heard before. "So? She's gone to the press? After everything we discussed about keeping family matters private?" The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with William's responses growing increasingly agitated. Staff members found reasons to walk past the study, curious about the unprecedented breach in royal composure, but too well trained to linger long enough to gather details. Thompson, however, was positioned where he could observe both the conversation and the comings and goings of other staff members, noting how the household seemed to collectively hold its breath. When the call finally ended, silence fell over the study for several long minutes. Then came the sound of something heavy hitting the wall, presumably a book or paperweight, followed by what could only be described as a sound of pure frustration. Thompson debated whether to check on the prince's well-being, but decided that discretion remained the better part of valor. Catherine appeared in the corridor about 20 minutes later, her face pale but determined. She knocked gently on the study door and waited for permission to enter. Thompson couldn't hear their conversation, but the tone was different, gentler, more supportive. When she emerged 40 minutes later, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and she walked quickly toward the private family quarters without acknowledging anyone she passed. The afternoon brought a series of emergency meetings. Palace communication staff arrived in unusually large numbers, their faces grave as they were ushered into conference rooms. Thompson noticed that several of the senior advisors who typically handled sensitive royal matters had been called in, including those who usually dealt with crisis management and media relations. It wasn't until early evening that Thompson learned what had triggered the day's crisis. Through careful observation and the inevitable gossip network that existed in any large household, he pieced together that Camilla had indeed spoken to a journalist, not for publication, but as background information for what was being described as a comprehensive examination of modern royal marriages. The conversation had apparently touched on subjects that were considered deeply private, including her observations about William's continuing grief for his mother and its impact on his marriage to Catherine. The revelation that his stepmother had discussed his private emotional struggles with an outsider seemed to have shattered something fundamental in William's carefully constructed emotional defenses. Staff members reported seeing him at various points throughout the day standing motionless in corridors, staring out windows, or sitting in his study without attending to the papers on his desk. Thompson's evening rounds took him past the portrait gallery again, and he found himself approaching with a mixture of dread and concern. Sure enough, William was there again, though this time he wasn't alone. Catherine sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, as they both gazed up at Diana's portrait. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear from any respectful distance, but their body language spoke of shared grief and mutual support. Later that evening, as Thompson completed his final security check, he encountered something unprecedented. William walking the corridors alone, without security escort, something that violated numerous protocols. The prince appeared to be lost in thought, moving through the castle as though he was seeing it for the first time, pausing to examine portraits and artifacts that he had passed thousands of times before. "Thompson," William said suddenly, startling the guard who hadn't realized the prince was aware of his presence. "How long have you worked here?" 23 years, Your Royal Highness," Thompson replied, uncertain about the appropriate protocol for this unusual interaction. 23 years, William repeated thoughtfully. "You knew my mother then. You were here when she died." It wasn't a question, but Thompson nodded anyway. "What do you remember about her?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Thompson couldn't fully grasp. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked him such a personal question about another royal. The boundaries between staff and family were carefully maintained, and this felt like a significant crossing of those lines. "She was very kind to the staff, Your Highness," Thompson said carefully. "Always remembered our names, asked about our families. She made everyone feel valued." William nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he already knew. She would have hated this, wouldn't she? All the secrets and maneuvering. She would have wanted everything to be honest and open, even if it was painful. Thompson found himself in the impossible position of being asked to interpret the feelings of the late Princess of Wales, but something in William's demeanor suggested that this wasn't really a question requiring an answer. It was more like a man thinking out loud, processing emotions that were too big to contain. "She loved you very much, Your Highness," Thompson said finally. Anyone could see that. William's eyes filled with tears again, but this time he made no effort to hide them. "I'm making such a mess of everything, Thompson. I don't know how to fix it, and I don't know who I can trust anymore." The admission was so raw, so vulnerable, that Thompson felt the weight of it settle in his chest. The conversation ended there, with William walking away into the deeper parts of the castle, leaving Thompson to wonder if he had just witnessed the beginning of a fundamental change in the royal family's carefully orchestrated existence. The night felt different now, charged with the electricity that comes before a storm, and Thompson had the distinct sense that tomorrow would bring consequences that none of them could fully predict. The third day after Camilla's departure brought an unexpected visitor to Windsor Castle that would change everything. Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Diana's elder sister, arrived unannounced in the early afternoon, her presence immediately causing a stir among the staff. Thompson, who had been present during some of Diana's visits with her family years ago, recognized Sarah immediately, though she looked older and more serious than he remembered. Sarah's visit was unprecedented for several reasons. First, the Spencer family had maintained a carefully respectful distance from royal affairs since Diana's death, appearing only at major ceremonial occasions. Second, her arrival hadn't been scheduled through the usual channels, suggesting an urgency that bypassed normal protocol. Most significantly, she had specifically requested to see William alone, without Catherine present. Thompson watched as Sarah was escorted to William's private study, noting the way she carried herself with a dignity that reminded him strongly of Diana. There was something purposeful in her step, as though she had come with a specific mission that couldn't be delayed. The meeting lasted for over 2 hours, during which time staff members reported hearing occasional raised voices, though never from Sarah herself. When the door finally opened, both William and Sarah emerged, looking emotionally drained. Sarah's eyes were red with tears, but there was also a sense of resolution in her posture, as though something important had been accomplished. William appeared different too. Not the broken man Thompson had observed over the past few days, but someone who looked as though he had been forced to confront truths he had been avoiding. "I'll have the car brought around for Lady Sarah," William instructed Thompson personally, which was unusual since such arrangements were typically handled by other staff members. As they waited for the vehicle, Thompson overheard part of their conversation in the entrance hall.
"She would have wanted you to know," Sarah was saying quietly. "Diana never intended for you to carry this burden alone, William.
She left specific instructions about this, but Charles thought you were too young at the time, and then later, she trailed off, but the implication was clear." "All these years," William replied, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years I thought I was honoring her memory by following the path laid out for me, but she never wanted that, did she?" Sarah shook her head sadly. "She wanted you to be happy, William. That was all she ever wanted for you and Harry. She specifically said in her letter that she hoped you would never feel obligated to choose duty over love the way she had to. She wanted you to learn from her experiences, not repeat them." The revelation that Diana had left letters or instructions that William had never seen sent shockwaves through Thompson's understanding of the royal family dynamics. As Sarah's car pulled away, Thompson watched William stand in the doorway for long minutes, staring after the vehicle as though it carried away years of assumptions about his life and choices. That evening brought another unprecedented event. Catherine requested a private audience with Thompson. Such a direct interaction between a royal family member and a security guard was virtually unheard of, but these seemed to be days when normal protocols were being abandoned in favor of more urgent concerns. "Thompson," Catherine began, her voice steady but tired, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "The other night, when you were doing your rounds, did you see William in the portrait gallery?" The question caught Thompson off guard. He had assumed his observation of William's emotional breakdown had gone unnoticed, and now he found himself in the difficult position of having to admit to witnessing such a private moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally, "I did observe His Royal Highness in the gallery." Catherine nodded, as though confirming something she already suspected. "He told me," she said simply. "He told me everything. About what Camilla said, about his conversation with the portrait, about his doubts. He said he thought you might have seen him, and he wanted me to know because he couldn't bear the thought of more secrets." Thompson felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that he wouldn't have to carry the secret alone, but also concern about how Catherine was processing this information about her husband's emotional state. "Ma'am, if I may?" Thompson began carefully. His Royal Highness was clearly under tremendous stress. Sometimes people say things in moments of grief that they don't necessarily mean in their clearer moments. Catherine smiled sadly.
"That's kind of you, Thompson, but we both know that sometimes it's in our most vulnerable moments that we tell the deepest truths."
William has been carrying this burden his entire adult life, and I think it was finally too heavy for him to bear alone.
She paused, looking toward the direction of the portrait gallery. "Sarah brought letters," Catherine continued. Letters Diana had written to both boys, to be given to them when they were old enough to understand. Charles decided to keep them sealed, thinking it would be easier for the boys to move forward without dwelling on their mother's words. But Diana had written about her hopes for their futures, her regrets about her own choices, her wishes for their happiness. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Thompson realized he was being trusted with information that could reshape public understanding of the royal family, and the weight of that trust felt enormous. "What did the letters say?" Thompson asked, then immediately worried he had overstepped boundaries by asking such a personal question. Catherine didn't seem to mind the question. In William's letter, Diana wrote about how she hoped he would never feel trapped by duty the way she had. She wrote about how she had married for the right reasons, but had never been truly happy until she found the courage to be herself. She specifically said she hoped he would choose love over expectation, even if it meant making unconventional choices. Thompson felt his understanding of the royal family's dynamics shifting fundamentally.
But His Royal Highness did choose love, didn't he? He married you. Catherine's smile was complex, mixing happiness with sorrow. Yes, but not without years of doubt and pressure to conform.
Diana's letter revealed that she had seen how the institution could crush authentic love, and she desperately wanted her sons to avoid that trap. She wrote that she hoped they would be braver than she had been, more willing to fight for what truly mattered. That night, Thompson's rounds took him past the portrait gallery once more, but this time he found it empty. Instead, he discovered William and Catherine in the castle's private chapel, a small, intimate space where royals had prayed and sought solace for centuries. They sat together in one of the front pews, William's head resting on Catherine's shoulder, both of them staring up at the simple altar. Thompson didn't intrude, but he could see from their posture that something fundamental had shifted between them. The crisis that had begun with Camilla's departure and escalated with her indiscreet revelations had somehow led to a deeper honesty between William and Catherine than they had perhaps ever achieved before. The next morning brought news that would change everything. William had requested an unprecedented private meeting with his father, King Charles III, and had specifically asked that no advisors or communication staff be present. Palace sources suggested that this would be a conversation between father and son, not between monarch and heir, and that topics would be discussed that had been carefully avoided for decades. As Thompson prepared for what promised to be another extraordinary day, he reflected on how a single moment of private grief had somehow set in motion a series of events that threatened to reshape one of the world's most traditional institutions. The man he had seen crying before his mother's portrait was no longer just carrying the burden of grief alone. He was finally ready to confront the choices that grief had influenced and the truths that had been hidden from him in the name of protection. King Charles III arrived at Windsor Castle on a grey Thursday morning, his convoy arriving with less fanfare than usual for a royal visit. Thompson had been instructed that the king's visit was to be treated with maximum discretion, with minimal staff presence and no official photographers. The unprecedented nature of the father-son meeting had created an atmosphere of nervous anticipation throughout the castle. The meeting was scheduled for Charles's former study, a room that held decades of history and countless difficult conversations. Thompson was positioned outside, as protocol demanded, but the heavy wooden doors couldn't completely contain what would become the most intense royal confrontation in modern history. "You kept them from me." William's voice cut through the morning quiet, his tone lacking the deference typically shown to the monarch. "For 26 years you kept her letters from me and Harry. Do you have any idea what those words would have meant to us?" Charles's response was initially too quiet to hear, but his tone suggested the careful diplomacy that had characterized his approach to family matters throughout his reign. However, William's voice rose again, carrying clearly through the door. "Protection? You call keeping my mother's final wishes from me protection? She specifically wrote about happiness, about choosing love, about not repeating her mistakes, and you decided I was better off not knowing?" The pain in William's voice was evident to anyone listening. "How many decisions did I make based on what I thought she would have wanted, when I never actually knew what she wanted?" Thompson heard the sound of footsteps pacing, and he could imagine William moving restlessly around the study, as he had during phone calls over the past few days. The conversation continued with increasing intensity, as long-buried grievances surfaced. "Sarah showed me everything," William continued. "The letter about following my heart, the specific mention of not letting duty override personal happiness, her hope that I would be braver than she was. And there's more, isn't there? More letters, more guidance she left that you've decided I shouldn't see?" This time Charles's response was audible, his voice carrying a defensive edge that Thompson had rarely heard from the usually composed monarch. "I was trying to help you move forward, William. Your mother's death was traumatic enough without her words continuing to influence decisions you needed to make as a future king."
Influence decisions? William's voice cracked with emotion.
"Her words wouldn't have influenced my decisions, they would have informed them. There's a difference, and it's a difference you never understood about her. She didn't try to manipulate or control, she tried to guide and support." Thompson heard the sound of papers rustling, presumably the letters that Sarah had brought. William's voice became quieter but more intense, the kind of controlled anger that can be more devastating than shouting. "Listen to this," William said. "This is what she wrote to me. My darling William, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to guide you through the choices you'll face about love and duty. Please know that above everything else, I want you to be truly happy. I'm married for the right reasons according to everyone else.
but I was never truly content until I learned to be myself. Don't make my mistakes. Don't choose what looks right to the world if it doesn't feel right in your heart. The crown will demand sacrifices, but your heart shouldn't have to be one of them. The silence that followed was profound, and Thompson could almost feel the weight of Diana's words settling over the room. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. She was always so idealistic, Charles said, but there was no criticism in his tone now, only sadness. She never understood that sometimes being king means making choices that break your heart because they serve the greater good. But that's exactly what she did understand, William replied. She understood it so well that she didn't want us to repeat her suffering. She wanted us to find a way to serve that didn't require destroying ourselves in the process. The conversation that followed revealed layers of family dynamics that Thompson had never suspected. Charles spoke about his own struggles with duty versus personal happiness, his decades of loving Camilla while being married to Diana, the guilt he carried about the breakdown of his first marriage. William talked about his years of uncertainty about Catherine, the pressure he felt to marry someone who would be acceptable to the institution, his fear that he was repeating patterns that had destroyed his parents' marriage. The night Camilla left, William said, she told me something I can't stop thinking about. She said I would never love her the way I should because part of my heart died with Mum. But that's not true, is it? Part of my heart didn't die with Mum. Part of my heart was never allowed to fully live because I was always trying to do what I thought would honor her memory instead of what would actually honor her wishes. Thompson heard Charles moving, presumably to sit down, and his voice when it came was heavier than before. Camilla was right about something else too, Charles said. She told me you were suffering, that you were carrying burdens that weren't yours to carry. I thought keeping the letters from you would spare you additional pain, but perhaps I was just protecting myself from having to confront my own failures as a father.
The admission seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere.
William's next words were gentler, though still firm. I need all of them, Father. Every letter, every note, every piece of guidance she left. I need to know what she actually wanted for my life, not what everyone else thought she would have wanted. There are 17 letters in total, Charles said quietly. Some for specific occasions. Your wedding, the birth of your children, your coronation when it comes. Others are more general guidance about navigating royal life while staying true to yourself. She spent months writing them in the final year of her life. Thompson felt the profound significance of this moment settling over him. 17 letters from Diana to her son, hidden for over 2 decades, were about to reshape one of the most important relationships in the modern monarchy. Why now? William asked. Why did Sarah decide to bring them now? Charles's answer revealed another layer of family complexity. She didn't decide on her own. Camilla contacted her after your argument. She told Sarah that she was watching you destroy yourself, trying to live up to an image of Diana that might not even be accurate, and that maybe it was time for you to know what your mother actually thought about these questions. The irony wasn't lost on Thompson. Camilla, in leaving, had potentially saved William's emotional well-being by ensuring he finally received his mother's guidance. The stepmother he had sometimes resented had recognized his suffering and taken action to address it, even at personal cost. The meeting continued for another hour, with father and son discussing practical matters, how to handle the media attention that would inevitably follow any significant change in royal behavior, how to address the institutional pressures that had kept the letters hidden, how to move forward with greater honesty while still fulfilling their constitutional roles. When Charles finally emerged from the study, Thompson was struck by how much older the king looked, as though years of carried weight had finally been acknowledged. William appeared drained but somehow lighter, carrying a leather portfolio that Thompson assumed contained his mother's letters. That evening, Thompson encountered Catherine in one of the castle's smaller sitting rooms, where she was reading quietly by the fireplace. She looked up as he passed, offering him a smile that seemed genuine for the first time in days.
He's reading them, she said simply, apparently comfortable sharing this information with the guard who had become an unexpected confidant in these extraordinary days. All 17 letters.
He says he wants to understand what she actually wanted before making any more major decisions. Thompson nodded, unsure of what response was appropriate. Catherine continued, her voice thoughtful. I think we're about to discover that the Diana we thought we knew from the media was quite different from the Diana who was writing guidance for her sons. The woman who wrote those letters sounds wise and practical, not just idealistic. As Thompson completed his evening rounds, he reflected on how a moment of private grief had somehow led to the unveiling of a 26-year-old secret that might fundamentally change the future of the British monarchy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. As William processed his mother's actual words rather than his assumptions about her wishes, But for the first time in days, Thompson sensed that the crisis was moving toward resolution, rather than deeper chaos. 3 weeks after Thompson's discovery in the Portrait Gallery, Windsor Castle felt like a different place entirely.
The atmosphere of crisis had been replaced by something Thompson could only describe as cautious optimism, though he knew that the changes set in motion by those extraordinary few days would continue to unfold for years to come. William had spent the better part of a week reading and rereading his mother's letters, often with Catherine beside him, sometimes discussing their contents late into the night in their private quarters. Thompson, whose role had somehow evolved from silent observer to trusted confidant, had been asked to ensure their privacy during these sessions, a responsibility he took seriously. The first major change came in William's relationship with Camilla. Rather than accepting her departure as final, he had made the unprecedented decision to travel to her sister's house in the Cotswolds to have what palace staff carefully termed a private family conversation. The meeting lasted most of a day, and when William returned, he announced that Camilla would be returning to the family, but under different circumstances.
She was right about almost everything. William told Thompson during one of their evening conversations that had become a regular, though highly unusual, part of the castle routine. I was carrying grief that was preventing me from being fully present in my relationships.
But she was wrong about one thing. The solution isn't for me to love less, it's for me to understand what love actually means.
The letters, William explained, had revealed a Diana who was far more nuanced and wise than the version of her that lived in his memories and in public perception.
She had written extensively about the difference between honoring someone's memory and being trapped by it, about how genuine love for a deceased person should inspire greater love for the living, not less.
Mum wrote about how grief can become a comfortable prison, William said, his voice thoughtful as they walked through the portrait gallery where this entire journey had begun. She said that true love always wants the beloved to grow and change and experience joy, even after death. She was worried that Harry and I would use missing her as an excuse to avoid fully engaging with life. The portrait of Diana seemed different now, somehow. Thompson wondered if it was simply his changed perspective, but the painted eyes that had witnessed so much drama seemed more peaceful, as though some long-held tension had been resolved. The second major change was in William's approach to his royal duties. Drawing from Diana's guidance about authenticity within institutional roles, he had begun pushing for what he called evolutionary changes in how the royal family engaged with the public. The letters had contained specific thoughts about modernizing the monarchy while maintaining its essential character, ideas that Diana had developed but never had the opportunity to implement.
She wrote about the difference between tradition and traditionalism, William explained to Thompson. Tradition is the living faith of the dead, but traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. She wanted us to honor the essential purpose of the monarchy while being willing to adapt the methods. These philosophical changes were already beginning to manifest in practical ways. William had announced that future royal engagements would include more unscripted interactions with the public, more opportunities for genuine conversation rather than formal ceremony. He had also quietly initiated discussions about making royal family communications more honest about both struggles and successes, following Diana's belief that authenticity created stronger connections than perfection. The third change was perhaps the most personal and profound.
William's relationship with Catherine had undergone what both described as a fundamental deepening. The crisis had forced them to confront assumptions and unspoken concerns that had influenced their marriage for years. One of Mum's letters was specifically about marriage, William told Thompson. She wrote about how she had made the mistake of trying to be what she thought Charles needed rather than being herself, and trusting that authentic love would be strong enough to handle reality. She warned me against making the same mistake, either trying to be someone I wasn't, or expecting Catherine to be someone she wasn't. Catherine had apparently embraced Diana's guidance as well, finding in the letters a mother-in-law's voice she had never been able to access directly. The letters contained specific thoughts about the challenges of marrying into the royal family, practical advice about maintaining personal identity within institutional demands, and encouragement about the unique contributions an outsider could make to royal traditions. The fourth change involved the broader royal family dynamics. The revelation of the hidden letters had prompted Charles to acknowledge other ways in which his protective instincts had perhaps prevented his sons from accessing guidance they needed. Harry had been contacted and would be receiving his own set of letters, though the process of rebuilding that relationship would clearly take more time and careful navigation. Camilla's return to the family had been managed with remarkable grace by all involved. Her willingness to acknowledge the pain her comments had caused, combined with her recognition that her departure had ultimately led to positive changes, had created an opportunity for more honest relationships all around. She and William had established what they described as a new understanding based on mutual respect rather than obligation. "She told me something interesting," William confided to Thompson. "She said that living with someone who was only partially emotionally available had been harder on her than she had admitted, even to herself. She thought she wanted me to get over Diana, but what she actually wanted was for me to process my grief in a way that allowed me to love more freely, not less deeply." 1 month after the crisis began, Thompson found himself once again making evening rounds through the portrait gallery. This time, however, he wasn't alone. William and Catherine were there with their children, who were looking up at their grandmother's portrait with curiosity rather than the solemnity that had previously characterized such moments. "Tell us about Grandmama," Princess Charlotte was asking, and William's response was different from the careful, reverent tone he had used in the past when discussing his mother with the children. "She was funny," William said, smiling at the portrait. "She loved to laugh, and she was always trying to make other people laugh too. She would have loved spending time with you and your brothers, probably would have taught you to play pranks on your father." The children giggled at this, and Thompson realized he was witnessing the emergence of a new family dynamic. One where Diana was remembered as a complete person rather than a sacred memory, where her influence was integrated into daily life rather than preserved in careful separation. Later that evening, as Thompson completed his final rounds, he encountered William one last time in the portrait gallery. But this time, the prince wasn't sitting in grief before his mother's image. Instead, he was hanging a new portrait beside Diana's, a recent family photograph showing him, Catherine, and their children laughing together in the castle gardens. "She would have liked this, don't you think?" William asked Thompson, gesturing toward both portraits, past and present together, each informing the other but neither dominating. Thompson nodded, understanding that he was witnessing the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The man who had been broken by the weight of unprocessed grief and hidden truths had found a way to honor both his mother's memory and his living family's needs. "Your Royal Highness," Thompson said carefully, "if I may ask, what was the most important thing your mother wrote in those letters?" William considered the question thoughtfully. "She wrote that love isn't something you have to choose between. Love for the past, love for the present, love for duty, love for personal happiness. She said that real love always makes room for more love, and that the goal isn't to balance competing loves but to find ways for them to strengthen each other." As Thompson made his way back through the castle corridors, he reflected on the extraordinary journey he had witnessed. A moment of private pain had somehow led to healing that extended far beyond one man's relationship with his mother's memory. The royal family that emerged from this crisis would be different, more honest, more integrated, more capable of honoring tradition while embracing growth. The portrait gallery, which had been a place of grief and secrets, had become a space where past and present could coexist peacefully. And Thompson, who had begun this story as a silent observer of royal pain, ended it as a witness to the power of truth-telling and the resilience of love that refuses to be constrained by fear or tradition. In the weeks and months that followed, the changes that began with those letters would continue to unfold. But the foundation had been established, a royal family willing to be guided by wisdom rather than assumption, by love rather than obligation, by the authentic desires of the dead rather than the projected needs of the living. Diana's true legacy, Thompson realized, wasn't the tragedy of her death, but the ongoing influence of her hope for her son's happiness, a hope that had finally been allowed to flourish.